Take your career to the next level. The University of South Florida, St. Petersburg is offering a master's degree in digital journalism and design. Do the entire program from home and complete it in as little as 1 year. For more information, email journalism@usf.edu or call 727-873-4544. The cost is reasonable. The experience is invaluable. From the worldwide leader in journalism, truth, and democracy, this is the Poynter Report Podcast, a joint production between the Poynter Institute and the Department of Journalism and Digital Communication at the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg. Now here's your host from the Poynter Institute, Tom Jones.
Hey everybody, welcome in. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. I'm so excited for our guest on today's episode of this Poynter Report Podcast. He was a longtime moderator at NBC's Meet the Press. He now hosts his own show on Newsphere, Sunday Night with Chuck Todd, along with the Chuck Toddcast, my favorite podcast name, by the way, Chuck Toddcast, which you can obviously find on YouTube and everywhere you get your podcast. He, of course, is Chuck Todd. Chuck, thanks so much for joining us.
It's great to see you, Tom.
Good to see you.
Like we've always been text,
Yeah.
We communicate via text. I'm glad to see you've got this podcast going. Love what you guys do at Poynter, and boy, do we need more of this all the time.
Well, I really appreciate it. And you helped us out a couple of years ago. I think it was during COVID. You came on and we talked about where we were politically at that time. And you've always been a great friend of Poynter. So we really appreciate it. I should say before we get rolling on this thing today, we're recording this episode on September the 16th. So it feels important to say that, considering all that's going on in the news these days, and particularly in the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk shooting. So there may be some news between the time when we record this and the time that you actually hear this. But Chuck, I wanted to actually start by talking about what's going on with you these days. You were at NBC, nearly 20 years, right?
Yeah, I guess it was.
Yeah,
Yes.
And nearly a decade hosting Meet the Press or moderating Meet the Press. And then you made the decision I guess it was in January of this year, to strike out on your own. How long were you thinking about that before you actually made the decision, I'm going to go out on my own here?
Well, I'd been thinking about what I was going to do next, starting after we came back from COVID. You get to a point in a job where the end is closer than the beginning, right? And I always wanted to try to leave a little bit before I was kicked out, type of mindset. You want to go a little bit before your sell-by date. So I'd been, I certainly had been keeping track of how independent world works a little bit. I've got my own, and I still have my own sort of, I am doing this as I try to figure out where we're going in journalism and information communications. And I certainly want to try to figure out the trust problem. I'd like to try to help rebuild, particularly local. I mean, I've come to the conclusion, I've spent the last couple of years, while trying to, still keep my voice out there a little bit, still sort of do my first love, which is political analysis, or as I sort of started to refer to myself as a political anthropologist, where you're just sort of trying to study these tribes and, how do they interact? I definitely think we're in a period of transition, and I've never, up until the last year I worked at NBC, I'd never worked at an organization that wasn't in growth mode. I was at a startup, and then we were bought by National Journal, and National Journal was trying to grow, and then we were bought by David Bradley, and then he bought the Atlantic, and it was always growth. And even when you did cuts, they were cuts in order to grow in another place, right? They were cuts in one place to grow in another. The multiple times that I went through the ebbs and flows of cuts and hirings at NBC, the cuts were always surgical and were always designed to help the news division grow somewhere else. Maybe it was shifting to cable, or then it was shifting to streaming, or then it was shifting to digital, right? The last year, it was pretty clear that the parent companies wanted out of the news divisions altogether, right? And we weren't growing, and there was really no place. It was, there was a time where the big institution seemed like it was the best place to do journalism, and now the big institution feels like it's the most stifling place to do journalism, right? Look, I miss the resources, I miss the reach, right? But I don't miss the editorial the sort of the what would I call it? Editorial, the business control of the editorial, right? I feel like that, for a long time, the people that ran the news divisions were journalists who learned how to be executives. And then you started to see a transition where these parent companies decided, no, they wanted business people to surgically shrink and essentially diminish the news divisions because they were starting to get in the way of the larger business.
Right. And I mean, you're already heading off into a topic that I was going to bring up eventually, but now seems to be the right time. Like, how closely have you been watching what's been going on with Skydance and Paramount and sort of what's, how they're sort of inserting themselves on what's going on at CBS News?
Well, it's interesting, but it's funny. It's like, I kind of think we spend so much time talking about a shrinking media environment and so little time talking about the growth media environment, right? More people get their news and information on YouTube than they do from the major networks combined, right? I mean, it's really not even a close call anymore. I think what you're seeing, I've equated what's happening. At first it was cable, but I think this is sort of with linear television in general, is that you're sort of seeing what happened to radio in the 80s and 90s, where you had one or two companies decide to be the consolidators. Right. And consolidation was the last way to make some money off of these legacy enterprises, right? Clear Channel, essentially just gobbled up whatever was left over in the world of radio. The major networks got out of it almost completely, right? NBC used to own radio, ABC, CBS, they all did, and they all got out. And I think that's what we're seeing now. So to me, I think that he's gathering all these assets. He sees a moment where he's got a friendly regulatory environment uniquely for him, right? Where he can probably if Warner Brothers agrees to it. Now we'll see if they do. Right. But my guess is if shareholders think this is the best value they're going to get, then risk splitting the company in two. It's probably more likely to happen than not. But I don't think, I think it's sort of like, okay, so you've got control of CBS and CNN. They're shrinking platforms. I don't think you're going to be able to rebrand. I think the brands themselves are sort of starting to get staler. My kids are in college. They don't automatically think of those entities as the first entity for news.
So how much did you think about that when you made your decision to leave? Because you mentioned a moment ago that there's the resources not only that NBC News and MSNBC provided you. I imagine, though, it was still a bit scary to go out on your own because, as with NBC, like people found you through NBC, whereas now they have to kind of seek you out as an individual. You know what I'm saying? Oh,
and it's, I run into people all the time that says, "Oh, I miss you here. What are you doing now?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm doing this." Right? You're right. Right now, I think. That said, I'm also, surprised at how many people going, "Wow, I now see you all the time." And I'm like, okay, I must be in your channels. I must be in your feeds, right? Whatever that is. But, it's interesting. I always assumed that the big networks would pivot and would still want to be essentially king of the information hill. Mm-hmm. And I think what surprised me is how little interest Iger, all these guys have had in doing this, right? I was the fool that would hear various CEOs say NBC News was the crown jewel. I heard it from GE CEOs and I heard it from Comcast CEOs. Right. But what I've learned about most crown jewels? It's stuff you keep in the attic, right? You don't bring out the crown jewels. You don't bring out your grandmother's favorite necklace. You're really impressed that it's been handed down, but do you use it every day? And I realize now crown jewel was code for we're not really investing anymore, but we do admire the history of the network.
Right. Yeah. When you left, what was your vision for what you wanted to do, and how close are you meeting that vision at this point, do you think? Or is it still evolving?
I think I'd like to think it's still evolving. I was listening to an interview that Jamie Dimon did recently, and he talked about his time after he got pushed out at Citibank.
Right.
And before he ended up where he ended up today. And he's, and he goes, and I was doing a lot of things in the various areas that I thought I wanted to work, but, I was doing a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit here. And after about 18 months, it all came together. Right. And so if I'm being completely transparent here, I'm intrigued by what we're doing at Newsphere, which is sort of a Substack alternative. I'm intrigued, I believe in owning my own content. I do think the near-term future for journalism is owning your content and then licensing it out, right? That there's going to be, and so I am a bigger believer now in doing that and creating partnerships, not necessarily, as I say, if you look at the history of technology and media, right? There's a new technology comes along, new media entities pop up, then we get, fragmentation occurs, and then we get consolidation. And it's sort of, if you think about it over the last couple of hundred years, that cycle has repeated itself, right? When we figured out how to reproduce the photograph, magazines proliferated, right? And we had hundreds of magazines. And then, of course, as we got moving pictures, the still pictures didn't, mattered less to us, and we evolved. I think that's what we're seeing with streaming and with digital. And so, my favorite thing to do is to run a newsroom, is to basically be a managing editor. Story assignments, story discovery, that is sort of what animates me more than anything. And so whether it's building in a company that allows local news to thrive and scale, whether it is trying to build an information network that tries to be grounded in reality, but is a place that is open to sort of mainstream left and right. I do think the news atmosphere is sort of dominated by the extremes, right? And part of that is sort of the way the tech companies have sort of perverted the information ecosystem with their algorithms. And so I do, there's a part of me that wants to plant the flag that, hey, there is something to trying to have a shared reality, shared space for both sides. I know, how dare I use that phrase, both sides, because I think it creates a healthier society. And I think we're now seeing the problems of when everybody retreats to their comfortable corners. So look, I sort of equate it. I don't like to bet roulette, but when I do, I always put a chip on the corners so that I have 4 numbers that I can hit rather than 1. So I would say that all the various things I'm doing, some of it is in public, some of it right now is I'm still working on behind the scenes. It's the equivalent of that, but I'm trying to figure out how to build a cleaner information ecosystem. I think it begins with local. I think there's some, I think our toxic political culture, probably it's going to be some political leaders and voters that have to stand up and clean that up. But I can do my part on the media side.
Is it hard to break through? I mean, it's such a crowded field right now. I mean, you have all these, obviously, like the traditional news organizations, but people who leave CNN or leave Washington Post, like, okay, I'm going to go do my thing. I mean, there's a lot of people fighting for very little time. So how do you sort of break through? How do you?
Well, look, I mean, what you discover is that the easy thing to do is to go partisan, right? You can build an audience quickly, and you can sort of get into the sort of, left-wing cocoon or right-wing cocoon.
Yeah, I mean, I look at somebody like Megyn Kelly, who's blown up doing what she does. No doubt. Yeah.
Right. Megyn Kelly, Pod Save America, and very much are sort of parallel tracks. But the problem is you become captive to your audience, right? When that is the deal you cut. So in a weird way, I kind of feel more unique than most in that I'm not trying to be in that partisan space. Now, it's a smaller pool right now. Because I do think I always joke, the person I'm trying to talk to is the one that's probably tuning out because they don't like the partisanship and the noise. But, I think that's what's frustrating is the opaqueness of the algorithms. Okay. Nobody understands it. People will think they have hacked it and figured out what moves the YouTube algorithm, what moves the TikTok algorithm. And then suddenly it'll change, right? What I have learned is how much the tech companies are responsible for our toxic culture and how much we don't know what to do about it.
That's scary.
I don't, I look at the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk assassination, and I'm really frustrated that it's only Spencer Cox that says, we got a problem here. And obviously we're not in a good situation if the current president doesn't see the situation as an American problem and only sees it as an opportunity to exploit politically.
You hear people, at least I do at Poynter, I hear people all the time like, look, I just want to get the facts. They not necessarily both sides ism, but they believe that most of us are a lot closer than the extremes of us. And yet, is there, I guess what I'm asking, like, is there an audience for what you're talking about, for what you want to do? Is there an audience, or people just like, no, I just want to go to my echo chamber and listen to my thing?
I hope there is.
Yeah.
Tom, what if there's not? Yeah. Where does that head us? Where does that lead us? I'm always looking for this. I have to curate my own feed, right, in order to get, I do it. I'm sure you do something similar as somebody who feels like you need to understand the pulse of all the different political communities that live online, whether it's in the world of MAGA or Truth Social, or in the world of mainstream conservative thought like the Dispatch or National Review, or you have mainstream liberal thought like the New York Times op-ed page, or the further to the left, the Jacobin and things like that. Like, I'm trying to see all of that. And I think that we were served better when you might see Ralph Nader and, and a Matt Schlapp appear in the same news program, rather than everybody going to places where they already have people that agree with them. Right. And so we've, there's so many, there's so many chicken and egg moments. One of the chicken and egg moments I've thought about is quote unquote micro-targeting. Before 2004, which was sort of the first election where we were using all this data about what magazines you subscribed to try to figure out who you were politically.
Yeah.
We were blissfully ignorant about undecided voters, and both parties just assumed they were centrist, that they wanted a little bit of the D's and a little bit of the R's. When we found out who the undecided voters really were, we realized, they had certain issues that they cared about. So if you found that issue that they cared about and you could fire them up about it, you could get them to your side. And so then all of a sudden, we had two political parties that no longer wanted to be making persuasive arguments to support their points of view. Instead, they were looking to find people that already agreed with them and said, hey, you should be on our team.
Right.
And we forgot how to do this. And then, of course, over time, the media sort of fell in line in that same, right? Think about the three cable channels in the 90s. All three of them attempted what I would call both-siderisms in a healthy way. Crossfire on CNN, Equal Time on MSNBC, Hannity and Combs on Fox.
Right.
And then Fox drops the Combs, CNN kills Crossfire, MSNBC dumps Equal Time, right? And because they found out their audience, they allowed the audience to be the managing editor. They found that Fox found that the conservative audience had no interest in hearing what Alan Combs had to say. And CNN's audience was didn't like the Crossfire because they didn't like Tucker, or they didn't like Buchanan, or whoever it was that was sitting in that right seat. And then, you had a similar situation at MS. And so they all decided to let their audience tell them how they should cover news, rather than using sort of the same goal, which was, we're trying to build a bigger audience. I always wanted more people to hear me, not less.
Right.
So I was trying to, and there's a whole chunk of people over here. So try to talk to that chunk of people. That's a marketing. That's the way I looked at it. It's a market, and there was a market, and I thought there was, and I still think there's a market for this. So I'm not giving up on it. I do think the tech companies and algorithms in general have sort of warped this idea that that we should have shared debate, right, and a shared place to trade partisan ideas.
Right. I actually think one of the worst, I did a thing, we were doing this Poynter 50 project where we're looking back at 50 great moments and impactful people over the last 50 years. And we talked about how CNN's coverage of the Gulf War was a big moment for cable television. But at the same time, we also talked a little bit about how these cable networks have to fill 24 hours a day. And the easy, cheap way to do it is let's throw 5 people on a set and just start yelling at one another. And
remember what CNN was at first, though, when they were 24-hour news? They would have they had a world hour. They had a politics hour. They had a sports hour. They had a business hour.
Sure.
And you're right. And guess what? They looked and they were like, oh, there's not that many people interested in the world hour. Oh, you know what? We are not sports enough. We don't have the credibility with the sports fan to compete there. So, everybody went to specialization. And, in some ways, the tech and the algorithms created an efficiency in the marketplace for ideas, but it to the point of where it drove us to, quote unquote, the specialists. And so the specialists in conservative talk was Fox, and the specialists in liberal talk was MSNBC. And then it was sort of, wherever CNN you want to put in, which was mostly sort of left adjacent, while trying to sort of be newsroom first. And, they've never really been able to find that balance on that front. But they at least make the effort. Right. Which I appreciate.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, what role will the media play as we move forward in a country that's so divided? Just 1 second. We'll be back. Hey, everybody. If you like this podcast, can I ask you a favor? I'd love to make sure you also subscribe to the Poynter Report newsletter, where I bring you the latest news and commentary about the media industry every weekday. If you're already signed up, thanks a lot. But you should also check out some of the other great newsletters we have at poynter.org/newsletters. My colleague, Kristen Hare, focuses on the local news scene in communities all across the country every Wednesday with Local Edition. My editor, Ren LaForme, gives you the roundup of the best media stories from Poynter every Friday in his Open Tabs newsletter. And if you care about misinformation, fact-checking, getting to the truth, the Factually newsletter has you covered. And if you're looking for some great ways to improve your skills in writing, leadership, or ethics, our weekly training digest has you covered. Just go to poynter.org/newsletters and sign up today. Chuck, I did want to ask you one thing. A couple of years ago, I came up to Washington and watched you tape an episode of Meet the Press, and I was so you guys get there. I remember thinking wow, I had to get there really early. You guys you were getting there 5:30, 6 in the morning, and really. And of course, this had been days in building up to the taping of the show. But was it David Gellis, right? Was your executive producer at the time?
At the end, yeah.
Uh-huh. And he was there, and I was just super impressed and I would expect this, of course, how much thought went into every moment, every second of Meet the Press. These days, now that you're out on your own, and this is something that I've always asked a lot when these people leave the sort of legacy media organizations where there's so much sometimes editorial control, but also you have people there to keep you from flying over a guardrail at some point. So how do you handle that at this point? Do you talk with people? Do you have a sort of an editor or producer that you do?
So I certainly have a couple of producers, one that I've full-time, producer and booker and sort of basically partner in all of this that I bounce plenty of ideas off of. But I'm not going to say I've replaced that great every morning at 9:30 or 10 o'clock, depending on what time we were starting our staff meeting. And I was doing a daily program in addition to the Sunday, and so it was a really healthy exercise because I was, ultimately, I do love being a managing editor, right? That's, more than anything else, this is, we should do this story. We should pursue this. Let's do a dive on this. This is being underlooked today and that sort of thing. And having just, multiple teams available for that, I will say this, AI is a pretty good research partner if you know how to use it as a research tool. So when I'm looking to go deeper on some topics, when I have guests, if that's a Lena Khan or, somebody who used to run one of these alphabet agencies, that I have not fully replaced my chief researcher back at Meet the Press, but there are more tools out there today that are helpful and certainly make sure I don't go over my skis. It's a good sort of, again, it's how you use it, right? You can't use it to generate ideas. What you do is you use it to test ideas, and you use it to research facts and look for, things you might have missed. When you use it that way, it's a really helpful and powerful tool.
Yeah. What's your favorite part about doing what you do now? Do you have a favorite part?
Yeah, having more control over my time and my schedule. Now, I find that I'm busier than ever. Yeah. Being in the content creation game and also trying to be an serial entrepreneur here. I definitely run out of time every day, but it's my time.
Right.
And, I am about to attend my third football game in 4 weeks in person on a Saturday, coming up soon. I have, I haven't been able to do that. My kids are in college now, and so I want to have the freedom to go. My kids are in Miami and Dallas, so I wanted the freedom to jump on a plane and go see them, and I've done that. So that's the number. I mean, here's the thing: working at NBC and working in the jobs that I worked at NBC is that if you didn't put, if family wasn't second or at least tied for first with your job, you weren't going to have that job for very long. It is not a family friendly place. That is not meant to be the industry is not family friendly. Politics, political news, Donald Trump in particular, right? Who can't sleep at night and doesn't have a lot of personal relationships, doesn't take vacations because he doesn't have. We can project, we can have an idea of why he doesn't really take vacations. Maybe he doesn't like to be by himself. Maybe he doesn't have people that want to hang. I don't know what it is, right? But he certainly, I think you're seeing a lot of burnout in Washington due to his style of politics, which is, I think we've got to be careful. I think that's a feature, not a bug, as far as that side is concerned, which is exhaust the journalists, exhaust the critics. And eventually they'll wear down and you can just get away with everything.
Well, not only exhaust those who are reporting the news or trying to explain the news, but those who are getting the news. I know a lot of people who I find very responsible citizens who have tuned out. Like, how much is that a concern of what you do now? Like, you're trying to reach people, but people are like, you know what, Chuck, I don't want to hear it. I just want to watch football.
Think about this all the time. I want I want to have the same feeling. I want people to have a similar feeling listening to my podcast as I do after I listen to Bill Simmons, which is, I feel like I learned something. I feel like I laughed at something. I feel like I didn't feel like I wasted my time,
right?
But I felt like I enjoyed myself. The problem with politics today is that some of the topics aren't very enjoyable. And I do worry about depressing people too much. And I do worry, my mother's a pretty good check on that. She'll be like, well, that was a dark episode. Now my God bless my mother, but the glass barely has condensation on it in her house sometimes, right? The glass isn't just half empty. It is been shattered. But I'm mindful of that. And I'm disappointed in that. I miss the pre-Trump era when there was, when you could have a little bit of fun with politics. Mm-hmm. I feel like we've punished fun, right? And in some ways, Trump sucked the fun out of it. Which is, look, innocence is lost sometimes, right? And it just is what it is. But I am mindful of that. It's also why I think the best way to reach these people that want to tune out is to go back and cover stories that help them live their lives. I do think the biggest error we've made in American journalism. It's funny, we're taping this on the day Robert Redford died.
Right.
I have a friend who I've gotten to know over the last couple of years in this journey to try to fix local news. A gentleman by the name of Richard Gingrich. He is longtime. He just retired from Google, but he was sort of led the Google News Initiative. And look, I've had my issues with Google and how they've, warped the ad industry for local news and all of this stuff. But he had an interesting observation about journalism. And he said the worst thing that happened to journalism was the movie All the President's Men. Why do you think that is, Tom?
I don't know. Because I think it's the greatest thing that's ever happened to journalism.
Well, here's his argument. It's that he goes, it made people think that the only good journalism is accountability journalism.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And accountability journalism's very important. It's also 10% of the journalism you should be producing if you're a news organization. 90% of what you should be doing should be helping people live their life, right? Why do most Americans say they like local news better than any other part of the news ecosystem? Because they
tells them what they help their daily lives.
And they fact check it every day.
Right.
Oh, they were right about the weather. Oh, they were wrong about the weather, right? But you get to fact check them every day. We stopped doing what I call service journalism. And then when we got, and here's the thing, when we had a very healthy ecosystem, you had local news was mostly service journalism, and national news was civics journalism. Okay? With the accountability that went with it and all of that. When we knocked out the foundation of service journalism, well, then people stopped seeing journalists as helping them and as public servants, and instead saw them as the national journalists who were lecturing them all the time.
Yeah.
And I do think that national journalists have never been trusted. Our trust was derivative. It came from local. And when we lost our local character references, as I say, a guy named Craig decided classifieds ought to be free, yada, 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 Donald Trump became president. And I do think that rebuilding local, starting with, I believe youth sports and local sports is the gateway to bringing a community back together. Red America and Blue America loves to watch their kids succeed. Youth sports is going to be a huge growth industry. You have the Caitlin Clark effect is creating gender equity in youth sports. So you're having even though we're on a demographic plateau as far as our birth rates, if you have an increase in girls participating in youth sports, you're going to actually have more participants in youth sports. And it's now a legitimate way to pay for college. So when you throw all that together, I think, if you start a local news operation focused on covering issues that the parents of youth sports people want first, number one, they're demographically very attractive to advertisers. They're all millennials right now. They're all under the age of 45. None of them are watching legacy television. Right. I just think it's both a business opportunity, but more importantly, if you start there, that's how you start to glue a community back together. Then you add weather and you add influencers that help you save money on food, whether it's where to shop or where to go out. Just like the old days, the newspaper had the coupons. Instead, you do it this way. And then once you build a trust where you've helped people navigate their local lives, then they'll trust you when you tell them that their city councilman's corrupt. But I do find that most of these local news startups are all journalism for journalists, and none of them prioritize what I call service journalism, which some journalists don't even think is journalism. But you know what? To the community, it's a lifeline. And I think that's the biggest disconnect. And we need to celebrate service journalism better. And so that local journalists are seen as in that sense, they're public servants. And I think that's what we've lost.
Has that ship sailed, or can we still get it back, you think?
I think we can get it back. And that's why I'm obsessed with youth sports. I mean, I have this large idea. I think you can scale this. I think there's a prototype that I've been working on and trying to come up with that I think works. And this is an industry, and I'll be frank, there's a lot of people wanting to get into the youth sports industry. Yeah. And if I can convince some of those people that, hey, here's a way that you can both create a hub for youth sports. Right now, that entire industry is siloed by sport. And if you think of more of it as a community, in each, then all of a sudden you can build a local audience. And if we build from there, then we have shared community again, and we have shared concerns again. Mm-hmm. Where the loss of local, I do think, is what sort of drove us to split apart.
Right. I was a sports writer for 30 years, and I started off covering high school sports and youth sports. And it crosses
all walks of life.
It's a
total different cross section. You get white, blue, pink, you name the color of the collar, and I promise you, they're kids playing a sport.
And I remember my kids have played sports, and I remember being on there with parents who, this person would have been, this is well before Trump came along, but this person would have been super MAGA, and this person would have been the most liberal person you ever met. And there they are having dinner at a Cracker Barrel where nobody was arguing about the logo of the place.
Right, because instead you're arguing about the ref that was terrible that game. How come we can't pay for better umps, for our kids' baseball? But the point is that you it goes back to, you see people as, most of us have the same hopes and dreams for our kids, and they're not ideological.
Right. Last thing before I let you go, Chuck, you're plugged in very well in Washington. You talk to lawmakers all the time, sort of the movers and shakers of the people who run our country. Is such a pivotal time? How concerned are you for sort of the future of the country? I mean, are we so divided now that we'll never come back together, or is there still room? Is there still hope?
So I ground myself in noting how similar the current period is with the first, arguably 25 years of the 20th century. In fact, I kind of think, I don't think we fully appreciate that after the 1918 pandemic, we also lost our minds. We banned alcohol for 10 years. If you think about it, right, I think about this when I try to make myself feel better about the anti-vax movement. It's like, well, I do think the pandemic has totally sort of made us sort of collectively, and we may look back and say, whoa, so I do think if you look at different historical parallels, that first 25 years, in the 20th century, it was the dawn of the industrial age. There were winners and losers. We had a shifting, working class economy that went from agrarian to industrial, and there were people that were falling through the cracks. We had abuse. We had, fear of immigrants, right? And so I look at where we are today and think, boy, we've done this before, and we did get out of it. Now, unfortunately, it took a depression and a world war to get out of it, right? And I also sometimes wonder I wish we had the Cold War back. And why do I say that? Because the Cold War, when our threats are from the outside, we know how to be a united front. Right. When our threats are from the inside, we rip each other apart, right? That's why pandemics are terrible for politics, right? And historically, that's been true. They're very divisive because they're internal, right? But when you're attacked from the outside, right? 9/11 happens. We were pretty unified for about 18 months. And even for another two, we were unified, and those were the bad guys. And we were arguing about how we should deal with them, not whether we should deal with them, right? Just like with the Cold War, the parties argued about how to deal with the Soviets, but they weren't having a debate about whether to deal with the Soviets. And so, that's how I have hope, which is, look, we'll have an existential threat and we'll sober up. But in the meantime, I do think it's one of those, I know the cliche, it gets worse before it gets better. Of course, there's part of me that thinks it gets worse before it gets really worse. But look, I'm very concerned about this moment with Charlie Kirk because of the rhetoric I've heard out of the president and out of Stephen Miller. And, radicalism breeds off of radicalism. And we can sit here and say who started it all day long. Doesn't matter. Radical, when you have a radical act and you respond radically, you only encourage more radical acts, and it becomes escalatory. And the fact that we don't have, every president in my lifetime, when they were faced with a moment like this, chose healing. Reagan, Clinton, Oklahoma City, Bush, 9/11, Obama in Charleston, right? Those were all moments that they could have exploited differently politically, right? Clinton in Oklahoma City, if he had sort of Trump's tactics on Oklahoma City, where that could have gone with conservative speech and all of that, right? And ditto with Obama and Charleston. They both chose to be Americans before they were partisans. And so, that's a concern I have, is that we don't have the leadership we need to meet the moment. And the Democratic Party doesn't have the credibility to be a counterweight right now, because I think the country elected Joe Biden to heal us, and he chose not to.
What do you mean by that, man?
Well, he governed very partisanly, and he didn't heal us. Now, maybe he just was physically incapable, right? Maybe if he'd been able to travel the country more, maybe if he'd been able to, I've always wondered, would Biden have been a different president had he been 15 years younger, in a variety of ways. But I do think that, the misinterpretation of the 2020 election by the Democrats is a huge issue. They viewed it as some sort of repudiation of Trump and Trumpism, when really all it was exhaustion from COVID and no more of this partisan fight. And Biden was seen as this guy who wasn't that kind of guy. Right. And then he got surrounded by partisans and he governed very progressively, right? And he could have chosen to put a Republican in charge of the border and do some national unity type things that might have actually been more effective at defanging the right. But he just wasn't a good enough politician or a good enough leader to do it. I mean, as a friend of mine likes to say, if Biden had been a better leader, Trump wouldn't have gotten a second term.
I lied. I had one more question. So what can the media do in this moment to heal the country, or is it our responsibility to do that? Should we just chronicle it?
I think our responsibility is to chronicle, but be honest about the chronicle, right? And don't get into but disease, right? I think I believe I know who's more at fault than the other side, okay? But I also know somebody on the other side believes they're less at fault than the other side. And the problem is, if you never are willing to concede, right now, neither party is comfortable conceding fault, because their bases will punish them for, quote unquote, giving the other side a win. And until we get out of that, right, we don't self-police. The media should self-police. The Democrats should self-police on their own side, and the Republicans should self-police on their own side. They did it some in the first term. They're not doing it in this term, and I think we're seeing the price of this. But I also think the media is we don't control our distribution, Tom. It's 4 or 5 tech companies that decide what gets amplified and what doesn't. And that, I think, I think the tech companies have more responsibility here for this political divide than any of us fully appreciate. And we really ought to, it's the algorithm. And I kind of think algorithms, the minute you create an algorithm, you've become a publisher. Right. And so I don't think there are any 230 protections. I'm surprised more lawyers haven't gone down this road, because I do think the intentional division that X, Facebook, Meta, TikTok, all of the different places, the fact that it's an algorithm designed to keep you agitated and keep you on the platform is doing real harm, like smoking. And here's the real tell. You know how we know this is bad? Because we're trying to protect our kids from it. If it's toxic for our kids, why do we think it's healthy for us?
Right. Again, you can find the Chuck Toddcast on YouTube and wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. You can also watch Sunday Night with Chuck Todd on Newsphere. Chuck, thanks so much. Great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Well, I appreciate you, Tom. You're one of the few that is trying to play umpire here in the media space. Well, it's not easy.
We try. Thanks so much. Thanks to you guys for watching and listening. If you really enjoy our conversations, please give us a like and a subscribe. Give us a nice review. It really helps out a bunch. Thanks so much for watching the Poynter Report Podcast. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Poynter Report Podcast. The podcast is produced by the Department of Journalism and Digital Communication at the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg. Executive producers are Elliot Weiser and Ren LaForme. Our producers are Tom Jones and Caden Knowles. Production assistant is Ariel Mankus. And our director is Christopher Campbell. And a special thank you to Neil Brown and Dr. Mark Walters.